If you were to come up to my house right now, knock on the door, I would fling it open and I would say, "Hey, it's so good to see you." And as obnoxious as that sounds, that's exactly how I greet every single person that walks through my door. I would welcome you in, I would offer you a cup of coffee, and we would sit at this table right here and we would talk about things that matter. Welcome to Home Edify. My name is Kristin Malphrus, and this is the place where we have conversations about what it takes to raise resilient, courageous, lifelong learners. So let's dive into it. Today, we have Sara Guenther with Sara Raising Wild. Welcome, Sara. Sara is an all-boy adventure mom from San Diego. She homeschools her kiddos in the process of their traveling. Her kiddos range from 6 to 14. And she's been homeschooling for 8 years. So welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here. I love that you were inspired to start this podcast, and it's just an honor to be on. So thank you.
Of course. Yeah. And I can't wait to learn from you. So unschooling. I see that a lot on your blog, and I know that's a methodology. Explain what this means for you and your family.
Yeah. So unschooling is, well, I'll kind of go over a little bit about what a lot of people view it as and a little bit about what it's not and how we just kind of draw from it to do the kind of homeschooling that we do. So unschooling can be looked at in a bunch of different ways. It can be as much as I guess an easy way to explain it would be interest-led learning, where you're kind of figuring out, okay, what is it that my children want to learn and being a facilitator to that. So it's not, picking out the curriculum and then sitting down and just shoving information in their faces and making them learn it. It's working with them to say, okay, maybe you've got one kid who wants to learn electrical engineering. And so you're helping them figure out, how am I going to learn this? Maybe another one wants to be a geologist. And so you're helping find out, what kind of field trips can we take for this? What kind of books do we need? Heading to the library a lot, things like that. For some people, it's a little bit more structured where, maybe you are picking curriculum to use for it. But again, it's because your children want to learn it. It's because they're interested in it.
Okay. So what is your rhythm? What does that look like? What does the unschooling rhythm look like?
Totally. So our rhythm has changed a lot over the years. A couple of years ago, when we were a little bit less unschoolish, I actually had a rhythm where I had, the list of subjects that we were going to cover, and we would kind of cycle through them about 3 or 4 days a week. We kind of clung to that a little bit as we started unschooling, but I found that the structure of it just wasn't really working with our travels. So once we started traveling, it really changed the game for us. Because we were on the road and going all over the place, we really just kind of used our travels as our learning experiences. So our big kids already knew how to read, but our little kids were learning reading because as we go to national parks, they hand out these little junior ranger books. And so the kids have to read through these junior ranger books to figure out how they can check off all the boxes and be able to get their junior ranger badge. So they're practicing reading because they want to learn how to read, because they want to get their junior ranger badges. So we are, as far as an actual rhythm, we haven't had much of one over the last maybe 2 years. The one thing that we do consistently do, it kind of falls off the wagon when we are on our travels, but when we're stationary, is I really like to have what I call a morning gather. And this is actually something I got from the Charlotte Mason method of homeschool, which we were a little bit more Charlotte Mason before we turned unschool. But that is a time when we get together in the morning and we all start off with the Bible being the most important one. But then we'll dive into different books for things that we're talking about at the moment. So sometimes I'll pick out, here in San Diego, we have, especially in winter, really great tide pools. So we get these extreme low tides where we can go out and see all sorts of creatures. There's octopus, there's sea stars, all these neat things that you can see that normally you wouldn't see when the tide is so high. And so sometimes I'll just say, hey, this is what's available to us right now, so let's learn about it. And so I'll do some research, pick out books that'll help us learn about sea creatures, and then we go take the trips to actually see them. And then as we're reading through the books, it's talking about a lot of the same things that we've already seen. So it's really helping solidify these things. And my kids are now able to say, we go to the tide pools and they can say, oh, hey, this is, here's a lobster, here's a sea star, picking out different types, the brittle sea star. So they're really learning to identify things around them that are in their natural environment.
That's awesome. Now, when you talked about the junior ranger, so, okay, I have my coffee cup here. It's a Yellowstone cup because just went to Yellowstone and I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and my daughter was able to get her junior ranger book, and you're exactly right. Like, I sat there in the bed with her that night, and we went through, and we still do. She brings it out every so often. She's like, "Mom, can you read me this page?" And she's in kindergarten. And so you're exactly right. Like, we've experienced that on some level, which is so cool to hear you talk about it, because it's like they get the badge, they get, or what is it, the vest or whatever. You can get the vest.
We
And they
haven't
get all their
gone
little
past.
pins.
Yeah.
That and well, okay, she's very what's the word? Type A, I guess you would say. So she like has to be decked out, and every so often we'll like go to see family members, and especially because we're in the Christmas season, and she'll have the vest on. She'll be like, "Okay, I'm going to teach you how to be a park ranger," to her little cousins. And so you talking about that, they learn so much from those adventures. So how many places have y'all been?
Gosh, we've done several cross country road trips. We actually haven't, I'd have to get my passport out to see how many of the national parks we've been to, but last year we went across country twice. We didn't necessarily stop at national parks like because our family's on the East Coast. And so we just kind of book it through, but we've been to a lot of states and we've seen a lot of really cool things. Most of the national parks we've been to have been here on the West Coast, since that's where most of our travels have been. But yeah, we went to Yellowstone on our last trip, and it was so beautiful.
My goodness, did y'all see the buffalo?
Yeah, they're hard to miss.
Well, funny story. We had some cross the road in front of us, and we sat there, I want to say, for like an hour waiting for this big herd to pass by us. So that is just so cool. And okay, so what kind of learning opportunity, you're talking about the tide pools, you're talking about like Yellowstone, those national parks. That just seems like an experience that you wouldn't be able to get anywhere else except for traveling. How can parents be intentional with finding these opportunities, even if they may not necessarily travel in the same way that you and your family do?
So I think knowing where you live is really important. When I first started, early on in our homeschool time, as my kids were kind of getting to the age where we could be a little bit more mobile, but just around our own area, I started joining Facebook groups where I could find out what are local hikes, where are local places to go camping. As at the time, a Charlotte Mason homeschool family, nature was really important. And it still is, of course, but that's really where our love of it grew. I really wanted my kids to be more in touch with nature, and especially since God made it. So we want to see and be able to love on what God has given us to take care of. So through these different Facebook groups, I found really neat spots that I could take my kids that was just right in our local area. Once I got a little bit more brave, I took my kids on a couple camping trips without my husband. And
wow.
Yeah, but it was really neat. I have an adventure bug. And so I would find these spots that were maybe like an hour or two away from home. And I'm like, okay, that's doable. We can do that. But if I'm going to drive 2 hours away, I might as well just stay the night. And the cheapest way to do that is to camp. So we did that a couple of times. For anyone who's not ready to do that, because I know that's a big undertaking, I really think that just knowing what's in your area and connecting with other moms, especially homeschool moms, some of the hikes that we ended up finding, actually one of our very favorite ones I found from another homeschool mom who just wanted to start a hiking group for homeschooled kids. And so I really think utilizing Facebook groups for that is a great way to connect with people who also know the area, and then you can share your finds.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We're actually a part of a co-op, and no joke, all of the hikes that we've been on, now we're in South Carolina, so we're in the lowlands. So hikes is a little generous, but we've been able to find these really cool nature spots, and it's all because of this co-op that I found on Facebook. So it's cool that that's that's a similarity there,
Yeah.
You're talking about these morning baskets that you do. And then how does that tie into the unschooling experience? It sounds like unschooling is super intentional. Like, a lot of people can write it off as like, oh, you're not actually taking the time, you're kind of just experiencing life. But it sounds like you're actually putting in a ton of intentional time to research what you can teach your children just day to day. What does that look like?
Absolutely. It is a lot of research. So what I like to do is ask my kids periodically. I don't even want to say it's at the beginning of the year, but I will do it then too. I just ask them periodically, what are you interested in? What is it that you want to learn right now? And sometimes they don't know. And that's okay. If they don't know, I say, well, I've got ideas. And so I kind of take it from there. And if it's working, we keep going with it. And if it's not working, we switch gears and move to something else. But it does take a lot of research. Usually I'm trying to say, like, so one of the things that we studied this past over the last couple of months, I really wanted to look at the Civil War era. In my ideal setup, what I would have been able to do was read through all the books that we read, which did take a lot of research. I actually have a couple movies on our list that we still didn't get to, but I like to try and put some movies in there. So we've got some other things that'll kind of, for the little guys especially, keep their attention, because the little ones aren't quite ready to talk about Civil War, but depending on what we can find, if it's something that we can incorporate them with and they're still catching bits and pieces of it, I really would have loved to have been able to do a field trip. There's nothing out here on the West Coast that's really helpful for the Civil War. But now that we've taken a look at it, the next time we travel to the East Coast, we'll be able to stop at Civil War sites and say, hey, remember when we talked about this? Hey, remember when we talked about that? So it's kind of keeping a list of what we've already studied, and then as we find other things, incorporating it into it. But it really does take a lot of research to kind of piece it all together.
So how long would you say, like, your lesson planning, so to speak? How long is that for you? Does that take a long time to do? Or is it you're interested in all of these things too, and so it just carries over into that?
Yeah, it does. I guess it kind of depends on what exactly I'm trying to plan out. Usually after the kids go to bed, I'll just kind of sit up researching things. And it's kind of hard to figure out how much time I actually spend doing it, because it's just little bits and pieces here and there. As I think of something, I'll, hop online and research something for 5 or 15 minutes or however long it takes to find what I need. It's kind of an ongoing and constant process that as an idea comes up, okay, now I'm going to research this and see what I can find to incorporate into what we're already learning.
That's awesome. So what are some cool opportunities that your kids have been able to experience because of the style of learning?
I think the travel has really been the neatest thing that we've done. And I will also say, so our home base is in San Diego, and we've got a lot of really cool stuff here. It's a very diverse area, and we've got mountains 45 minutes one way, the ocean right the other direction. We've got desert landscapes, coastal landscapes, kind of have a lot here. So there's a lot to see, but the travel's really been, I think for me, the most interesting part of it, because they've gotten to experience so many different areas and landscapes and animals. And I love that no matter where you live, even if you don't travel, you can still learn about these other landscapes. And I mean, you think about, like, in a typical school setting, kids are learning different types of weather patterns, and they'll learn, well, what is a plateau? Well, we've actually seen plateaus because we've driven through areas where they have these beautiful mountains, and then there's some plateau areas. And I remember one of my kids we hadn't talked about it yet, but we're driving through and he's like, Mom, why does the mountain over there, like, it looks like the top of the mountain was just cut off? And I was like, yeah, let's talk about that. So there's
That's
things
awesome.
and they're noticing it. And I think because I'm not necessarily pushing information at them, they're getting to ask a lot of questions, like seeing that and saying, hey, why is the top of that mountain cut off? So they're noticing that there's differences when we go look at different things, and they start asking questions, which just leads to more research, I think it's just the curiosity is really an important piece of unschooling, or just education in general.
Right? Curiosity driven. How do you think this is going to impact them long term for being lifelong learners? Because it sounds like you get to model that for them because you're constantly researching these places and you get to share that with them. So cool thing is, like, they see mom is researching and figuring out these things, but how do you think that's going to affect them long term?
I really hope they have a travel bug, kind of like I do. My dream is that when I'm older and I have grandkids, that we get to go do this stuff together. And then I love the idea of being able to help my grandkids in their learning journey as well. I'm really hoping too that, just like you said, being a lifelong learner, that curiosity is something that doesn't get squashed. I know that a lot of times in a school setting, it can kind of get squashed because it's just a constant. And honestly, homeschool can do the same thing. It's kind of the approach, is if it's a constant, here's the information you have to learn. Here's the information you have to learn. Here's the information you have to learn. Sometimes the space for the curiosity can kind of get pushed out because maybe there isn't enough time, or there's too much focus on finishing through a curriculum. And so the questions kind of get pushed aside and said, hey, we'll come back to this later. But I'm hoping that because we have such a focus on curiosity and looking things up and digging deeper, that'll carry over into adulthood for them, that they'll keep having that curiosity. For me, a lot of it since coming out of school, it's come back. I mean, there's so many things that I want to know. Like, there isn't enough time in the day to research it all.
Right.
And so sometimes I kind of have to remind myself, well, it's okay if you don't know everything. Clearly we can never do. But I love that process of asking questions and trying to find answers. And so I am hoping, like you said, that modeling that for them, that they'll continue to do the same thing. And I don't know, they'll just always be curious.
That's awesome. So you talk a lot about, like, you went from traditional homeschooling to this more curiosity driven method. How did you, what caused you to flip, like to get to that point where it's like, okay, let's just research what we see. Let's do this style of learning. What led you to that point?
So there's kind of a few things. One was the first cross-country trip that we did. We spent about 4 months we were on the road, maybe. We were in such a time, we were actually traveling in the trailer that I'm sitting in right now. It's a little 20-foot trailer, all 7 of us. It's very, very small. And there's weight limits when you're traveling in these things. So there's only so much stuff we could bring with us. And so I had to make some really hard decisions. What curriculum can we bring with us? Are we even going to need this curriculum while we're on the road? Turns out we didn't need any of it. So that was one of the things that kind of forced me in that direction. Another thing was, I remember I was actually out on a hike and my kids were we stopped in this area. My kids were kind of playing. And I started talking to this other woman she was coming through, and she said she had met a family that the kids were in public school, but they had moved from a foreign country. And when they came over, they were escaping some persecution. They came to the United States and they weren't able to enroll their kids in school right away. And their children ended up taking an entire year off of school. And in the process, they're trying to learn the language. They're just trying to get themselves set up here. And when the kids went back into school the following year, they were totally fine. They actually were not behind because the parents were intentional about keeping up the kids' education at home and just pouring into them and loving on them as people. And so when they jumped into school the next year, yeah, they didn't cover all the same things in their year off that the school kids were covering, but they were able to just jump back in and keep going with what the teachers were teaching. They weren't like behind, like people think you will be if you skip school for a year. And that was really interesting to me. And I remember coming home and saying to my husband, what would you think, hypothetically, if we experimentally took a year off of homeschool? What do you think would happen? And he's like, no, you can't do that. So I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to push that. We won't do that. But then we go out on the road for a while and homeschool looked a lot different than it had ever looked before. And I remember looking back and was like, I think we kind of just unintentionally took a year off of homeschool, except our kids learned so much. It was incredible. And so that was kind of the switch in my head that said, hey, we can do this a different way and our kids can still learn. I mean, the basics that we need to cover are we need to know how to read, need to know how to write, and we need to know some basic math. You know those things, you can learn anything. And so in not pushing certain subjects and following the things that they wanted to learn, we were still picking up on all of those things. And so it was just really interesting process watching this happen right before my very eyes. Another thing that kind of helped me with that was there was a book that I had read pretty early on before I started researching any of the unschooling stuff. It's called Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. Have you heard of that book?
Haven't.
It's a really interesting book. He was actually from San Diego. And so he talks about this area, which was kind of neat because I knew the places he was talking about. But it's this idea that children are going through, he calls it nature deficit disorder. And it's behavior. Like you can see how kids they're wired to want to go climb and move and jump, and they can learn in that process. But when we're making them sit down at a desk for 6 to 8 hours a day, it's squashing them. And so they're having a hard time focusing. They're having a hard time memorizing things because they're in a situation where they're doing things that they don't want to learn. And again, homeschoolers can be just as guilty of doing this. But if you give them the space to go outside, get the fresh air, climb the trees, just be wild kids. They can learn in that. But then also when they do come back inside and you cuddle up together to read a book, they're just going to learn it that much better because their brains are better prepared to sit down and absorb the information.
That's interesting. That's interesting because like most of our homeschool days, I send them out in the morning to play, and by the time they get back inside, it's like they are just ready. They're fully prepared. And there's just something about being outside playing and that you talking about that, it it feels like a good confirmation, at least for me, that that's a good process, you know?
Yeah.
So you talk on your blog about traveling in a sailboat as a child. Tell me more about that because I think you were in the British Virgin Islands. How did that impact you as a parent? What did being raised in that type of environment? What did that do for this experience you're on now?
So it's funny, the time that I spent on the boat, it was kind of a small portion of my childhood, but we were kind of there off and on for part of my elementary school journey. And then we came back to the States when I was in 6th grade and I went to a traditional public middle school. But that time that we spent down there was some of the best years of my life. I just have all of my best memories come from the time that we spent there. My brothers were all much older than me, so it was really just me with my mom and my dad. But they gave me a lot of freedom to explore. Even though I went to a tiny little school. It was actually a really neat school. I was the only kid in my grade. There was 15 kids in the whole elementary school. And we would have swimming classes on Wednesdays where we would just walk from the school down to the beach next to the ferry dock that was probably so polluted. But the water was beautiful. And we would just go in and go swimming. And then when we were done, they'd walk us back over to school. And there was if you dug through the grounds there, you could find old pieces of pottery that were I have no idea how old they were. I didn't really do any research on it, but just old like native pottery that had been lost underground where they ended up building this little school. And then on the weekends, we would go travel either to different parts of the island or to different islands. And I had a lot of time where I was able to just kind of go explore. My favorite thing was to be underwater. And so I was underwater all of the time. I one time found this little kind of like an underwater tunnel that I could swim through. And I just remember feeling like these are treasures, seeing all of these things under the water. It was just beautiful. And then they also gave me the freedom. There was this neat little hike that I liked to do that I had to go for like a walk on. I don't remember how far it was, but it was a good walk to get to this resort where there was this neat little hike that was going up to the top of the hill. And from the top of that hill, I could look down and see where our boat was. And they gave me the freedom to go do that by myself. I would go and do that hike on my own and just so much exploring. And I loved it. And I don't know if I was just born with this adventure bug or if it had to do with some of these experiences. But looking back on that time that I was given the freedom to go do that exploration without a parent behind me saying, hey, are you okay? Hey, don't trip on this. Hey, watch out for that. Hey, don't jump off of this rock in that way. Or, don't climb up the slide backwards. It just gave me the freedom to gain my own confidence, to go out and find. And I saw it as like conquering the world. And so as a parent, I want that for my kids. I don't want to be following along behind them, telling them, hey, you can't do this. Hey, don't do that. Hey, watch out for this. Well, be careful. I think we can prepare them for looking for where dangers are that they might need to be aware of. Like in Southern California, we have to watch out for rattlesnakes. So we have conversations like, hey, don't stick your hand in a hole if you can't see what's in there first. But giving them the freedom to go out and explore, knowing what dangers to look for, it gives them a sense of independence that I think as adults they're going to need. And just a confidence to go be who they are and explore on their own and kind of learn from their own mistakes as well.
So it's not just an educational thing that focuses, like we talk about focusing on the mind, focusing on character, but it sounds like it really builds this resilience in your kids. What's the biggest joy you've had in homeschooling your kids with this method so far?
I think just watching them have the freedom, especially for my little ones, to have the freedom to just be kids. I love that they get to spend so much time playing with, which research has shown that play is so essential for kids. So I love that they get to do all of that. And then seeing how they're still learning. In the meantime, my now 7-year-old taught himself how to read maybe 2 years ago, which is we'd sit down and read books together, and he kind of picked it up on his own. I have another child who, just to give the opposite end of the spectrum, you would call him what people call a struggling reader, is I guess where you would classify him. He's about to turn 10 and he's just picking up on reading now. And so one of the joys of unschooling in this area is I think it's easy to get really worried as a parent when we see kids who are following the traditional school model. They're starting to learn to read in kindergarten. If they're not reading fluently by second grade, it's red flags everywhere. So it's hard to watch your 9-year-old struggling to read and not have these feelings, these insecure feelings within yourself, thinking, hey, am I messing up? Am I doing this wrong? But over the last couple of months, he's really been picking it up on his own because he's ready now. He actually said to me the other day, Mom, I think I actually kind of like reading now. And I'm like, great. If this is something that I had forced on you, you might not be loving reading right now, but you're actually enjoying it because I didn't push it and you were able to pick it up when you were ready. And so I think one of the joys of unschooling is seeing your kids learn these things because they want to learn them, and seeing them actually enjoy them because they did it because they wanted to do it and because they were ready to do it, not just doing it because somebody forced it into them and said, hey, you need to learn how to do this by this time.
Right. No, it's so funny you're talking about the play-based learning. And I keep going back to my kindergarten and my experience, but I see so much of what you're saying in the learning process with her. Like, we're trying to learn this word and she's trying to learn how to read. And I realize she has no context of this word. So her brain is like, that is not a thing. Whatever this is, I don't know what this is. And so I've realized a lot that play and experiences really help create a learning environment for reading, because she has the knowledge of what is this thing, even to be able to read it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Hearing you say that, that's good. That's good. Now, I've seen some stuff about deschooling on your blog. How did this deschooling, what's that process? What does it look like?
It's an excellent question. So deschooling, I hadn't even heard of it until after we started unschooling. And then I met somebody who she talks a lot about deschooling. That's kind of her main topic. And I was like, wow, this really makes it all fall into place. And I think the transition to unschooling, it went really well for us, but I think it could have gone even better had I known about deschooling beforehand. So deschooling is kind of the idea of, if you went to, say, a public or a private school your whole life, we're kind of conditioned to think of school in the, preschool or K through 12 mentality, and following the state set standards of what we have to learn and when we have to learn it and what school's supposed to look like. So, we sit down to learn this, and then we go have some circle time, and then there's lunch and recess. And it's kind of the whole, basically how all of school typically goes. So deschooling is getting your mind out of that mind frame and thinking more just the basic question of, what is education? How do I approach it? And I think in homeschool, or at least I did this, when I started off homeschooling, it looked much like what I was used to, which was the school model. And that was kind of what I followed. And so deschooling, the easiest way to do it is kind of like what I had said we unintentionally did, but just take time off of school. It's usually suggested for people who are pulling their kids out of the school, if they're going to go start homeschooling, is to just take time off. Just don't do anything. Don't push the quote unquote educational things, and just be with your kids. Just live life, spend time with them, go have fun together, go on adventures, read books together, and then take a look and see, well, what have my kids been learning in this time that I've not been doing these things? So I think deschooling can be a process because, or at least it has been for me, because you think you get out of the school mentality and you do things differently, but then you might get to an area where maybe there's some pushback. There's something that you do want to work on with your kids, or maybe there's an area where you really know that your kid does need help with something, and maybe they might be pushing back against it. But a lot of times it can be because, like, how am I approaching this? Like, if I think we just take so much from the way that we were schooled, and unintentionally incorporate it into our homeschool, which is easy to do because it's all we've ever known. But
Exactly.
I kind of like to look and think, okay, this might sound a little out of context, but what did education look like tribal groups? How did kids learn then? How did they learn how to survive? And a lot of it is they're learning from the adults in the group, but they're also learning from other peers. They're learning how to interact with each other. And then as they're getting older, maybe the boys are going out hunting with the men, and they're seeing from an example. No one ever sat them down and said, okay, here's hunting 101. We're gonna, open this book and read these things, and then you're gonna get a test. And it's very experience based. And so I think when we step back and start asking these questions like, well, what does my kid need to learn? And how do I want to approach that? We can really see it in a whole new light. And I think it just opens the door to possibilities of how we can cover these topics without being a drudgery.
I like that. I like that. And you talking about this is out of context. I actually think a lot of times of the founding fathers of like our country. And back then it was like this apprenticeship based learning style. And so what you're talking about is like modeling for your kids what it means to be educated and to learn. That is super cool. I would encourage anyone listening to go back and read the biographies of people like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and Teddy Roosevelt and their lifestyles and how they actually learned. Because what you're saying, I mean, it makes sense. It really does. So what has been the biggest hardship as far that you've had to overcome while teaching your kids?
I think kind of going back to that concept of deschooling has been one of the hardest things, getting my mind out of that mindset of school has to look a certain way and my kids have to learn certain things on a certain timeline. It really can be hard to get yourself out of that place. And then it's hard too explaining it to people. It looks weird. It's weird because it's not what the majority of people do. And so I think the biggest encouragement is finding other people who do it and reading other books that talk about it. There's a couple of really great authors out there who have books on the subject. And it's always so encouraging to read those things because it's very easy, I think, to get down on yourself for how you're doing it. And again, when what your kids are learning doesn't match up with what other kids are learning, and maybe you're hanging out with a friend and the one friend says, oh, you don't know how to divide these numbers, and all the other kids that age maybe know how to divide numbers, but you haven't covered it yet because it hasn't been important to their journey yet. Doesn't mean that they won't learn it, but reframing your mind to think, hey, just because something is important to learn, it doesn't mean I have to learn it right now. Maybe I can learn it later, but there's other things that we learned earlier just because it fit in with the flow of what we were doing, or because my kids asked, hey, I really want to learn how to do this thing. And maybe it was hard for them because typically kids might learn it a little bit later. So maybe they have to work harder on it. But yeah, I think really just changing mindset for me was one of the hardest things to get over. And I'm not going to say I'm 100% over it. We all still have our days. It's a journey.
Yeah, it's so hard not to type into Google, what should a kindergartner be doing at this age, or, like all those things. But I feel like in society from the time that they're born, really, we're taught these milestones like, hey, if your kid's not doing this, then they're behind. How hard was that to detach from that almost maybe comparison mindset of comparing your kids to other people and where they're at? I feel like even in the homeschool community, we can even be very comparison minded, where we compare ourselves, our homeschooling journey with another family. And I feel like everybody, from what I've seen, and of course I'm new to this, but everybody has such a different path of how they homeschool and what's best for their kids. What's your encouragement for new moms entering into this world of homeschooling? How do they combat that?
I think really, well, for one, leaning into prayer. One of the things that we did a few years ago, and I found it incredibly helpful, was to sit down and figure out, what are my values? Actually, I'm going to recommend another book. This one also kind of kicked off my unschool journey. It's called, I want to make sure I get it right. It's called Minimalist Homeschooling by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, Zara Fagan, I think.
We'll tag it at the end so they can be able to find it.
Perfect. That was one of the earlier books on unschooling it's not on unschooling. It's a minimalist homeschool approach, But I was interested in it because we are minimalists. And so at the time I was like, well, what would a minimalist homeschool look like? Because my husband had kind of said like, you're covering a lot of stuff and some of it maybe seems like it's frills and maybe you don't need to do all of this. And I'm like, no, I need to do all of the things. It's the beautiful thing. And it is beautiful stuff, but it was probably too much at the time. So reading this book, one of her encouragements is to go over what are your values. And so writing out a list of what our values were, not necessarily for education, but for life. So what are my values with my boys? What are my values as a parent? And narrowing that down really helped direct the way that we learn and deciding what's important. Putting relationship above education too, I think is another big one because, if you're butting heads with your kid, nothing's going to get through. So working on relationships, and for us, one of our big values is stewardship. And that's really played into our travels. If we're good stewards of creation, we're going to be respecting nature. And one of the best ways to do that is to learn about it. And even as little guys, it's just being physically in it and touching it. The best way to learn about it is to be there touching it and doing things. And you're going to love what you're familiar with.
I love that. Oh my goodness. That is so good. I have chills right now listening to you talk about that. You mentioned the minimalist approach and you're in a camper, right? Like you're traveling. What does minimalist style homeschooling look like, especially with record keeping? Because I feel like there's a lot of moms that I've talked to that are like, I have to hold on to everything. And what happens if the state starts knocking? What's your method to record keeping?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I used to hang on to more stuff in the past, but because of our small space, I can't possibly hang on to it all. I started just kind of letting things, I threw stuff in the trash, honestly. One of my kids' favorite with a math curriculum that we had followed for years, we were very intentionally following a math curriculum. We do it a little different now. One of their favorite things was once they finished through the workbook, throwing it in the trash can. And so I would let them like,
we're done.
Yeah. It was the best feeling. I'm like, you did it. You accomplished. You can go do what you want with this book. And they would just slam it in the trash can. And it was just so funny to watch. But as far as the record keeping, what I do now is I keep a list on my phone. And it's a running list. I'm constantly adding to it throughout the year, just of all of the things that so it might be national parks that we've gone to and the junior ranger badges that they've gotten. A lot of it is books that we read. I utilize the library so much. We can't possibly keep a ton of books and curriculum in our tiny trailer. We're coming and going with the library. When I can't do that, we're using YouTube videos and we do a lot of, I'll get books on, my kids love audiobooks, so we do that. And then we'll do ebooks and things too. But I keep track of all of that on my phone, field trips that we take. If there's just any, I don't know, if my kids end up taking a class or something, I write that down as well. What I do recommend, because I know that homeschool laws vary by state. We happen to live in a state where it's very relaxed. Surprisingly, in California, it's not very strict rules here. But I do still make sure that I check out what the laws are so that I know that I'm following them. And then I have something written down for what my kids have done that make sure we check off those boxes. HSLDA is a really great website to go to. It's Homeschool Legal Defense Association, I think. Maybe we can link that one as well. You can check by state and you can see what all the laws are for your state and what I know some states have a couple different options, different routes that you can do for homeschooling. Definitely knowing what the laws are is important, that if someone knocks on your door, you're following it. But I think if you have the space and you want to keep the things, especially if you need it as proof for where you live, that could be helpful. But for me personally, I haven't held on to anything. No one's come knocking on my door yet. Praise the Lord. But I think also my kids and what they know and the way that they are, I think it kind of speaks for itself. And again, I don't know what they would ask if they came knocking, but we have a lot of proof that we're really intentional with our kids and we pour a lot into them. Even if it looks different from what the schools are doing, we're still learning all of those things. It just looks different.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, biggest encouragement for a parent teetering on the edge of whether or not they should dive into homeschooling. Would you say just go for it? Well, what would you say?
I always say just go for it. Just because I love it so much. I think it wasn't originally my dream. It was something that I just kind of felt led to do. And I was terrified my first year. I was absolutely terrified. What if I screw up my kid? But the longer I do it, the more I fall in love with it. And I realize, yeah, it's different than what I thought it would look like, but it is such a blessing. It's a blessing to get to spend all of this time with them, to really get to know them, and to make sure that family comes first. I mean, we love having community, we love our friends, but being the number one influence in my children's lives is so important to me. And so I think for anyone who's on the fence, I just say, just go for it. Focus on those relationships first, focus on loving on your kids well and pouring into them as people, focusing on their character, and then all the other things will fall into place.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And there's an aspect of faith with it from what you're talking about. What has faith? How has that played a role in your homeschooling?
God is the number one thing in our homeschool. I know I'd mentioned in our morning gather, he's the first thing that we talk about. We always talk about, we open up our Bibles. I have a little companion book that goes along with it too, that we're kind of digging into a little bit more information about biblical times. So that's an easy way to cover history, by the way.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And then we pray with each other. And I just think that, I mean, he created us. He gave us as parents our babies. They're his, and we're taking care of them. Just knowing how much God loves us and takes care of us, and being able to talk about that with our kids, and like looking at kind of going back to history. The Bible covers some history, but then there's a whole bunch of other world history too. And I love that when we look at that with our kids, we can see, look at how God has worked through all of these things. Look at how people have messed up all of these things. But God just loves us so much. And when we travel, seeing what he has made the most diverse world. And it is absolutely stunning. And for me personally, I really feel closest to him when I'm out in these quiet naturescapes, looking at what he's made. I just think he's the most brilliant author and artist of all time. And sharing that with my kids is so beautiful. And I just hope that they're catching a piece of that when we go out there too. I just think having God woven through all of the things that we're doing and everything that we're learning, it really puts meaning to everything. Sometimes it can be hard as a kid. They're like, well, why do I need this math stuff? But really pointing everything back to the gospel. And I don't know, it gives purpose to what we're doing.
That's awesome. So I've seen on your Instagram that y'all have had some hairy moments with park rangers and that sort of thing. What is the funniest moment you've had living this intentional life with your kids on the road?
Oh my goodness. All right. How are you feeling about potty talk?
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
There's been a lot of funny moments, and I'm not gonna lie, they all involve bathroom humor.
You have boys, so I mean that's to be expected, I feel like.
I do. I have all boys. Okay, so I've got a few. One's not potty humor. I'll give you a couple of quick stories. When we travel, I'll give you the non-potty humor first. When we travel, we do a lot of, we might stay somewhere like a national park for a while, but then when we're on the road getting to the next destination, sometimes we'll have to stay in like a Cracker Barrel parking lot or a Walmart parking lot. There's a lot of places where you can park overnight for free. They allow travelers to do that. So we've made a lot of great use of that to help with the budget when we're traveling. So for a while, we were doing a lot of Walmart stops, and it was a great place to stop, use their bathrooms, stock up on groceries, anything else we might need. Lots of Walmart. So when we got back to San Diego after our last trip, and we're still living in our camper, but we're living in it in San Diego, and I had to go run to a Walmart for something. And so we get in our minivan, not even our tow vehicle, it's just our minivan. And we drive into the Walmart parking lot. All right, guys, we just got to run into the store real quick for this one thing. And my little guy looks up and he goes, look, Mom, it's Walmart. Are we sleeping here tonight? No.
That is funny.
We're not
That is
eating at
hilarious.
Walmart tonight. They're just so used to it. That wasn't an issue with park rangers. It was funny. So we have had, actually, we didn't get in trouble for this other one either, but we got stranded in a place. So boondocking is when you stay somewhere that's free, like public land, like Bureau of Land Management land. There's lots of places that you can park and just stay for free. There's usually a limit of time on it. So this one spot that we went to, while we were there for a whole week. And we have very small tanks that, like, when you go to the bathroom, it gets stored in a tank. And they're not very big on our trailer. And so usually I have my boys pee outside because it just saves space in the tank for other things. So our car broke down and we got stranded in this spot after already having been there for a whole week. So I go back into the trailer and I go to use the bathroom. The women are allowed to pee inside, by the way. And the only one in the family, that's just me.
There you go.
So I go in there and I realize the tank is completely full, like full to the brim. This is a problem because now we have no car and we're stuck here and our tank is full. So luckily there was a bathroom. It was kind of a hike to get to it, but there was one that we could use kind of off in the distance. So I made good use of that. But one of my more adventurous children, there was a creek in this area and the kids would go kind of just play it was really cold, but they'd go play in the creek. They'd kind of have some fun in there. We took baths in there, but one of my kids decided he wanted to see what would happen if he went number 2 in the creek. He wanted to know if it would sink or float.
Buoyancy test. There you go. This is educational, okay?
Exactly. So he did. And then when we got to this park that we're staying at in San Diego, my littlest one, we've had to take some nature poops. It's happened. And he's still kind of learning the concept of where it's appropriate to pee on a tree and where it's not appropriate to pee on a tree. So he goes, there's a spot in the park where there's all of the campsites and then there's some trees. And he kind of walks behind one of the trees where he thinks he's hiding. But on the other side is the bathrooms and the road. And so he's not realizing he's covered on one side, but he's very exposed to the entire park on the other side. And so I'm walking back the other direction and I see him thinking he's hiding and he starts to drop his pants, but he wasn't planning on peeing. He had to do something else. So I yelled quick and he looks up and he pulls up his pants and I was like, "What are you doing, buddy?" And he's like, "Nothing." But I caught him and knew exactly what he thought he was going to do. And so we had to have a little conversation. You can't do that on the lawn at a park like that.
All right. A learning opportunity. There you go.
So many learning opportunities.
Man. Well, I like to ask this at the end of the podcast, and I have so enjoyed hearing all of your stories and just learning all this information from you. One of the last questions that I have is, what is a book that has shaped your life to lead you to this moment? Because as moms and as parents that are homeschooling, we're in a process of a lifelong education. We're modeling that for our kids, like we've talked about. So what is a book that you would recommend that has shaped you? It could be any genre.
There are so many, honestly. The Bible, of course, is my number one book. The 2 that I had mentioned already, The Last Child in the Woods and Minimalist Homeschooling, I think are the ones that really most shaped my homeschool. They were kind of my like gateway book that got me into the type of homeschooling that we do today. And since then, I've found so many. Anything by Peter Gray or John Holt are really great books. Just for kind of looking at things from an unschooling perspective, like how do kids learn best? What is the best way to educate a child? They're also fantastic, and I can send you a couple of things if you want to link a couple of those books by those authors as well. They're just so good. It's like the more books I read, the more I find that I think are amazing.
That's awesome.
There's another one that I'll recommend. It's great, not specifically for homeschooling, but I think just for when you look at homeschooling as like an overall approach to life, the book Hold On to Your Kids is a really good one. It just talks about the importance of family life and making family the number one influence over peers or over coaches or things like that. That was also just a really fantastic read that just shaped our approach to family life.
That's awesome. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for being here on the podcast with us. And you can find Sarah on Instagram. Her handle is Sarah Raising Wild. I promise that you will get all kinds of good stuff out of watching her reels and consuming her content. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Or
I really
thank you
appreciate it.
so much, Kristin. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Home Edify podcast. All literature, book recommendations, and websites mentioned in today's show will be linked in the details below. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. And don't forget to follow along on Instagram at Home Edify Podcast to enjoy clips from our latest episodes and day-to-day encouragement. Our prayer is that you were inspired to seek after your child's heart and mind. Thanks again for listening.
So, Mom, are you done with your podcast?
Yeah, I learned so much.
Thanks for coming to the podcast. Bye.